about consumer-centric dynamic journeys.
Thank you, Skia. So you've heard so far about business model innovation. We've talked a bit about experience innovation as well, and Philip's talked about what experiences are and how we can influence them. We've heard a bit about empathy and the role of empathy and attitudes in innovation. And what I'm going to talk about is now a lens for understanding all of that and putting it together as a consumer-centric journey. And you understand a little bit why I talk about dynamic journeys here. We do, as Philip's already explained, live in an age of experience. And I would say that life was a lot simpler when it was just us trying to get our products in front of people. We now have to create experiences for them. As Philip said, you've got to try and wrap an experience around your product. And everything that your brand does becomes part of that consumer experience, that human experience that he was talking about. That they become part of this journey that your consumers are on with you. And I think wrapping that relevant and compelling experience around your brand is something that's quite difficult. Sometimes many brands will fail. And in large part, I think it's made more difficult by this massive gap that we often find between what your brand might promise and what your brand is actually able to deliver. And in some cases, these promises will create expectations. And I think it's when you don't meet those expectations that it can often lead to disappointment. And even without those massive promises though, I think it's still really difficult for a brand to achieve a really seamless customer experience. I was recently on a flight, actually a couple of days ago, I just got back from Europe on Turkish Airlines. Who here has flown Turkish Airlines? Anybody? A few people. And how did you feel about it? Pretty good? Not so good. So I see a bit of a mixed reaction. And I think my overall experience was probably okay. It was probably fine. And I think they suffered a little bit from what Mark was just talking about. I was probably satisfied, but I certainly wasn't delighted. And why was that? Well, if you think about my experience with them, the journey starts long before the flight. Right? So it starts when you're looking for prices, and sure, while I was looking for flights and routes and all of that was kind of fine. But as soon as I came to check in, I thought, oh, okay, let me check in, let me try the app. So I have to download the app. I was like, fine, okay, let's have a look. And I tried to check in. And what happened? I had to put in all sorts of details. I got to the end of it, and the app crashed. And lost all my details. So I had to start again. I'm like, okay, fine, I can do it. Let's go into it. Get to the last point, hit the button, and I get an error message. And the message says, no, we can't check you in. But it doesn't tell me why, really. It basically said that I didn't have a seat. I was like, well, okay, that sounds a bit weird. So I get to the airport the next day, and I go, and I've got the machine there, and I go and punch everything in, and give me the same message. So now I'm kind of irritated, right? So then there's a person that was up at the front, and I said, well, sort of got to them, and I said, well, I can't check in. And they said, oh, just go down there. Long story short, there were a couple of interactions with people that then sort of got me back on track. But overall, on the flight, it felt okay, but nothing really delighted me. Nothing made me feel this was, I never felt special. And if I contrast that with my favorite airline, there's a gap. There's a massive gap. And I think what Mark was talking about, that empathy is what, if I was to put my finger on something, that's what I was finding from Emirates that I wasn't finding. It's the difference came in the services and in the way that I was treated. Yeah, so it's hard to put your finger on what exactly it was, but all the way through the journey, I felt there was a better experience with Emirates. And that, as I said, the journey starts long before the flight, and it ends long way after the flight. Some of the things that they do, some of the things that Emirates does, are outside of the flight. So, you know, if you're flying business class in Emirates, they'll send someone to pick you up. They'll sort that out. One thing I will say that I enjoyed with Turkish Airlines was they gave us a pair of slippers. And the slippers, and I love hotel slippers. I mean, this is a very weird thing. So I love them, but they almost never fit me. I have size 12 feet, and they almost never fit. The Turkish Airlines would fit brilliantly. So that's something that will live on from that experience. But I think making a seamless experience for the consumer is actually quite difficult, and a lot of brands fail, and partly because they think about them from a brand-centric view. We've already talked a little bit about how we need to be more customer-centric, and what happens when you're brand-centric is you think about your departments, the way that you're structured, your silos, you think of people as accounts, and they have various different logins. So now I have to log into your app, I have to log into this, and it doesn't remember me from one to the other. I then I'm treated as a transaction. I'm not treated as a person. And I think we've got to very quickly transition to experiences. We've got to integrate all of those various different accounts that we're talking about. Treat people as people, continuation from one service to another, and then have those be consumer decisions that we're focused on, not just transactions. So that's what it feels like when you start to move towards a more consumer-centric journey. And as part of the journey, we need lenses, we need ways to be able to think about these journeys. And so what we went on a journey ourselves to try and find a good way of thinking about journeys. So like any good researchers, we went and did some of the research to try and understand what things were out there. And when we were all, doing marketing 101, one of the things we would have learned is to do with the funnel, and everybody thinks about funnel, and that's one way that you can think of how your consumers are moving through the market. Well, this was an attempt from McKinsey, I think most people would have seen this by now, to try and take that linear view and turn it into something that's a bit less linear, so a bit more non-linear. And some of the things that they were doing here I thought were quite useful. The loyalty loop, introducing a way that if you've got loyal customers, they might actually skip some parts of that funnel. I thought bringing in experience was actually something that was quite useful in here. But still, it felt like it wasn't quite reflecting where we wanted to go. And one of the other things that we came across, and many of you would have come across, is Procter & Gamble uses the idea of the moment of truth quite a lot, and they've used it over the years with their businesses around the world. It's the idea that you have your brand in the market, and the first time that the consumer will be faced with your brand is at the shop. And it could be a virtual shop, or different ways of thinking about a shop, but this is where they come face to face with your brand. And that's your first moment of truth. Your second moment of truth is then the experience, when they take it home and use it. Google then built on that and created something called the zero moment of truth. So that comes before the first moment of truth. And that really comes from the fact that we're now connected consumers. We have opportunities to do a lot more research. We always used to do research. We always would ask people, what was your experience with a particular brand? But now we can do this in a more seamless way. We can do this in a more connected way. We can do search, watch videos, ask your people in your network, and those people in your network might be on the other side of the world, might be people you've never met before. You can also read reviews or even watch reviews. You can watch YouTube videos. I recently bought a vacuum cleaner, and we watched loads of videos of people moving around with their vacuum cleaners, trying to see, telling us how the experience was for them. So this is the kind of thing that will happen in that zero moment of truth. But still, we weren't quite sold on where that kind of framework was going. And one of the things that we wanted to include in the framework was this idea of moments of influence. Because yes, you could define various points along the journey, but actually those points are only meaningful to us as marketers and researchers if we can do something in those moments. So those are moments of influence where we believe that strong, positive, lasting memories are created. And that's part of what Philip was talking about earlier, was this idea of creating a memorable experience. To do that, you've got to introduce emotion, and so emotion has a role to play, and we can debate that how much of a role emotion has to play, but there is always the most memorable experiences and the most memorable interactions are going to involve emotion. So that's where we can influence the choice, we can deepen the loyalty, we can create excitement and increase loyalty. And those memories are important. Now, who's watched this particular TED Talk by Daniel Kahneman? Anybody here? Show of hands? A couple of people. It's a really important talk, and so Daniel Kahneman's a very important person. You would have heard of him from Thinking Fast and Slow, Behavioral Economics, and this is a very, it's a short video, and I'd suggest that you go and watch it. But here, he talks about the difference between the remembering self and the experiencing self. One of the key points that he makes, and this is not usually the point that people quote from the talk, one of the points that I thought was really interesting was that he says most of the moments of our lives, most of them are fleeting and they don't leave a trace. And I think this is an important point that we're making. So yes, we can talk about how we can make memorable experiences, but actually most of the moments in our lives, moments that generally defined as about 3 to 4 seconds in your life, and so you have about 60,000 of those in a month, about 600 million of those in a year. There's loads and loads and loads of moments that you have, and most of those just disappear. We don't remember them. And it's important because we actually don't choose between the experiences themselves, but we choose between the memory of those experiences. We choose between what we think we're going to remember. And because of that, it's important when we make those interactions, they need to be memorable, branded experiences. So that's how we can influence people and make sure that they are choosing our brands. And this goes back to Philip's example earlier of the iced tea. It was kind of memorable, but it was not as much of a branded experience as potentially it could have been. So when you do that, you manage to maximize the value to the customer, but you also maximize the business impact. So, okay, well, so there's supposed to, imagine on the left, there's a pie chart up here. For some reason it's not there at the moment. It's gone. Well, this is what it looks like, but it's supposed to be there. So there's, and maybe I'll just jump into this then. So this is the what we ended up on. A framework that is consumer-centric, that focuses on language that's not overly academic or impractical. It's quite a pragmatic view of, well, you start down the bottom here, and in fact you can start at any point because various brands will have different ways of getting into that consumer journey. So this is why we put it into a circle, put it into a pie, and each of those can be used in different combinations. So I'll start in the bottom left though, because that's kind of the traditional place where a journey might be seen to start. So where do you see the brand? When do you start to need a particular brand? And in that case, you might start to think about the different brands that are in your consideration set. You then get into discovering it, and that includes some of that zero moment of truth that we were talking about earlier, where you might go and do active research to do with the brand. Getting it is to do with the shopping experience, so how do I actually get hold of the brand? Usage experience on the right-hand side, and then sharing it, and that's where you get into advocacy, where you might share the actual brand, but you might also share your experiences of the brand. So that's what's covered on there. And I'll just go back to this slide again, is to say that depending on the kind of brand that you're talking about, you might have a different combination and a different path through those various different moments. Okay? So if I was talking about, let's go back to a beer brand like we talked earlier, you might see it on an advert. You might then have a need because you're in a bar. You might discover that it's the lowest carb beer. If I talk about Castle Light, for example, you might then go to get it. So you're at the bar. You might see this massive hunk of ice on the bar. I don't know if anyone's seen that, but that's how Castle Light would stand out. And then the use of it. So what does it taste like compared to some of the other things that you would use. But you might go through a very different journey if it was something like Uber Eats, where I need to eat something, and then to get the service I have to download the app, and then to use it, It's as easy as using Uber, which I'm already used to. I then will share my experiences with other people. Maybe I had a really shocking experience, maybe I had a good experience. And then only then I might start seeing it, because maybe I hadn't heard of it before or seen it. And I start to see it on my YouTube feed. Every time I bring up YouTube now, I get Uber Eats adverts. So that's the way that framework might work. And I talked a little bit ago about being able to influence each of these moments. And that's why I bring up all the marketing activity here. These are the sorts of things that we might be able to do at each of those various points. So ultimately, we start with this simple framework of these are the things that your consumers are doing along the way. But it can be quite complex. So to uncover each of the things that are happening underneath, there's a lot that will go into it, and a lot of these things are interconnected, but ultimately you want to map out that journey. And how do we do that? Well, traditionally, there are some measures that we would tend to use. A lot of it is survey-based. We might use, for example, our tracking to understand what people are seeing. We might look into the usage and attitude stuff that we would usually do to understand what things they need, etc. So we go all the way through using things like your customer, your scanner panels, your customer database, etc. And that's how we would traditionally measure some of these things. But I want you to imagine a different world, a world in which we're not asking questions anymore. So imagine a world where a lot of this stuff is more passive, a lot of this stuff is more behavioral, a lot of the stuff, the answers to those questions of where are we on the journey and how well is our brand doing on the journey comes from other data sources. And that's where I'll hand over to Hansi, who's going to talk a little bit about what we do in that space.